Hello there, and welcome to my painting guide for the Bretonian Knights for Warhammer the Old World. As you can see, I sprayed up the horses white and the knights black. I want to have a little bit of variation with the horses so they don't all look the same, so I'm going to paint them two different colours. The one you're seeing on screen right now is the contrast Gore Grunter Fur, and the other is the contrast paint Wildwood. Once the contrast paints are dry, we're going to mix a little bit of Skag Brown with some Bestigor Flesh to start the first highlight on the Gore Grunter Fur. This is followed by adding a little bit more Bestigor Flesh to the mix just to brighten up that highlight ever so slightly. We're not going as far as we did with the first layer, just mainly sticking to the edges. And finally, we'll add a little bit more Bestigor Flesh to the mix, just to concentrate on the main bends and the very slight edges. To add a little bit of depth to the fur at the bottom of the feet, we're going to add some contrast medium to some Gore Grunter Fur and just run it ever so slightly up the leg. Going back to the Wildwood contrast paint, I want a couple of these horses that I've painted with the Wildwood to be a little bit darker, so we're going to give them a second coat. For the highlights of the lighter Wormwood, we're going to mix in some Catan Flesh to the paint just to start highlighting just the same as we did with the Gore Grunter Fur. I'll then add some Blood Reaver Flesh to the mix just to start picking out those slight edges and bends. And then adding a little bit more Blood Reaver Flesh for the final highlight. For the darker ones, we're going to use Dryad Bark and mixed with some Gorthor Brown just to start picking out those highlights. I'm only going to do one coat of this. There won't be really any need to do any others because I want these guys to be as subtly dark as possible. With the horse's fur out of the way, I then moved on to the chainmail sections. I'm going to paint those with Iron Hands Steel. And then I will give all of that area a wash with some Nuln Oil. While that wash dries, I'm going to start on the knights. I'll use the same metallic that I used for the chainmail, and I'll just fill in all the areas that will be metal on these knights. As the shields are separate, I'll also do those as well. I'm only going to be doing the silver part of the shields when they're separate. I will be doing the main colours when I actually glue them to the bases, so that's why I'm not using any fancy toothpicks or anything like that. I'll then give all the metal I've just painted a wash with some Nuln Oil. That's given plenty of time for the wash on the horses to dry, so I'm then going to start highlighting those with some Stormhost Silver. Now it's time to add some colour to the actual horses, so I'm going to start blocking in all the areas that I want to be red with some Flesh Tearers red contrast paint. I'm going to make sure I keep the pattern varied on each horses so they don't look completely uniform, but they will still have roughly the same colour scheme. While I make sure that contrast paint is 100% dry, I'm going to go back to the knights and I start highlighting those guys with some Stormhost Silver. With the armour out of the way, we're going to move back to the red. I'm going to start layering the red with some Wazdaka red on each of the areas that I've previously painted. After that, I'm going to add a little bit of white to the Wazdaka red just to brighten up slightly so I can start the edge highlighting. And then I'll add a little bit more white just so I can do the final edge highlight. Now the red is out of the way, I'm going to start the black. I'm going to use Black Templar contrast paint on all the areas I've chosen to be black. It's going to take 2 coats because I'm painting on white, so it's going to come through as very thin. After those coats have dried, I'm going to use some Rhinox hide to paint the saddle and all the straps. And that will be followed up by a wash of Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, I'm going to finish off the black. I'm going to use Corvus Black to paint in all the first layer. Followed by Eshin Grey to do an edge highlight. With the black out of the way and the wash dry, I'm going to use some Doombril Brown to highlight all the leather straps we've just painted. We're going to be painting the emblems the same way as we did for the men-at-arms. If you haven't watched that video, you can check that out. I painted those. They're much more dirtier because obviously they're peasants. So I started to get that out of the way. I used Mephiston red to paint all the red areas. Sticking with the red and black theme, I've picked out areas I want to be red on the knights, and as the Mephiston red is out at the moment, I'm going to get that done as well. And that'll be followed up by a wash of Carroburg Crimson. Next up is Evil Sun's Scarlet. We're going to use that to start painting in the squares. We're going to use that a little bit neater. We're going to neaten up these squares completely when we actually paint the black in as well. We'll also use this as an opportunity to paint the red areas on the knights as well. Finally, I'm going to edge highlight the banners with some Wild Rider red. And we'll do the same for the knights. With the red finally out of the way, we'll start moving on to the blacks. We'll use Abaddon Black to start filling in all the details that we need. And we'll tidy up all the black areas on the knights as well. I then used Eshin Grey to paint the edge highlighting on all the details we've just painted black, including that of the knights. I'll then use Dryad Bark to paint all of the leather that's going to be on the knights. That includes their belt and any buckles. I'll then use Gal Vorbak Red on the sword sheaths. And Screamer Pink on the hilts. Everything we just painted will then get a wash with Nuln Oil. While that dries, I will use a couple of coats of contrast and Basil Canum Grey on the horse's hooves. I'll then reapply Gal Vorbak Red just to brighten that colour up a little bit. And I'll then highlight that with Wordbearer's Red. I'll then reapply Screamer Pink to the handles of the swords just to brighten that up. I'll then use some Retributor Armor Gold to paint some gold sections into the areas to brighten up some colours on both the horses and the knights. All of that will then receive a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. I'll then finish off the buckles and the things on the horses' faces with some Iron Hand Steel, along with marking out any studs. All of that will then receive a wash of Nuln Oil. To finish off the gold, I'm going to use some Liberator Gold to do some edge highlighting. Next, we're going to use some Abaddon Black to paint the eyes of the horses. Now, horses' eyes are normally brown, but because all of my horses are brown, I'm just going to leave them black. For the final stage of most of the knights, I'm going to use some Grey Sear to paint the ribbon around the top of their helmet, followed by a matte white highlight. I'll then use Zandari Dust on the horse's teeth, and that'll be highlighted with some Pallid Witch Flesh. I'm going to use Black Templar contrast paint on all of the horses' tails. Again, it'll be 2 coats as we are painting over some white. And while that's drying, we're going to finish off the musician. We're going to start his face and paint that with some Bugman's Glow, which will be given a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. If, like me, you've given one of your champions a falcon, we're going to start with some Catachan flesh all over the feathers, which will be dry brushed with some Godreaver flesh, followed up by another dry brush of Gothor Brown. His breast will be painted with some Flayed One flesh. Now this will take a couple of coats because we are painting light colour on black. And then we'll paint the feet and the beak with some Avalan Sunset. And while that dries, we'll use Cadian Flesh Tone to start highlighting the flesh on the musician, which will then also be highlighted with some Kislev flesh. We'll then paint his eyes in place with a little bit of Black Templar, followed up by some matte white, and Black Templar again for the pupils. I'm going to highlight a little bit on the trumpet with some Stormhost Silver. And then I will finally paint his hair with some Zandari Dust. That'll then get a wash of soft tone from Army Painter. Moving back to the Falcon, I'm going to paint the tiny little bit of cloth that's dangling from his helmet with Mephiston Red. And then I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to just start marking in a little bit of sort of detailing on the feathers, just randomly here and there, just to make it look like he's got a little bit more detail than he actually has. I'll also use this opportunity to tidy up his helmet and tip the end of his beak as well. And then I'll use some soft tone just to give a tiny little bit of depth and detail to his beak and his feet. I'll use Retributor Armor Gold to paint the tip of his helmet. And then using some Dryad Bark, I'm going to paint a little bit of detailing on his breasts. Again, same as we did with the back. It's going to be sort of very blotchy and very random. Finally, for painting, I'm going to give a quick dry brush to all the tails with some Eshin Grey. Next, I applied Stirland Mud Technical paint to the bases of all the horses. And once it was dry, I gave it a dry brush with Zandari Dust. I then used Deathwold Forest to paint the grassy areas coming up from the hooves. Painted the rims of the bases with Dryad Bark. And then finally, giving the grassy areas a quick wash with some soft tone. Having painted the shields earlier, I then went ahead and started to add the transfers. There is a video on my channel if you want to check out to see how I do transfers, so I won't run through that now. As well as the shields, I also placed the transfers on the horses as well. To finish everything off, I layered the base with some PVA glue in preparation to put on some static grass. And lastly, I added a couple of static grass clumps as well. And with that final step, that's the first unit of Bretonian Knights finished. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really do hope that it helped you if you were struggling on painting these guys. They are quite a joy to paint, but it will take a long time because even though there's not much detail on them, there is still a lot to do. These guys actually took me longer to paint than the 18 Men-at-Arms. I hope you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.